Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blazing a Trail, a conversation with three remarkable African Nova Scotians. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki. We live, work, and play on the ancestral land that belongs to the Mi'kmaq people. As we seek to build a more inclusive municipality, we remember that we are all treaty people. African Heritage Month at Halifax Public Libraries is made possible by generous funding from the TD Ready Commitment. Events are being hosted across all of our branches and were created by library partners, community members, and library staff. To help keep each other safe and healthy, our community came together to reimagine African Heritage Month for 2022. Thank you, TD and the Ready Commitment, for your continued support. Share your African Heritage Month photos and moments on Twitter and Instagram with the hashtag AHM2022. We are at HFXPubLib, and TD is at TD_Canada. We'll have a Q&A period at the end of this program. Please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to post any questions. You can do this at any time throughout the evening. Please note that tonight's program is being recorded, and we ask that you do not take any screenshots or photos. And without further ado, we're so pleased to have Lindsay Ruck as our moderator tonight. Lindsay Ruck was born in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and is a graduate of Carleton University's School of Journalism in Ottawa. Since graduating in 2008, she has worked in the marketing, communications, and publishing fields. Similar to her grandfather, the late Calvin W. Ruck, she has a deep and abiding respect and affection for her home province of Nova Scotia. She has recently returned to Halifax after living in Ottawa for 12 years to further her career as a writer and editor. Lindsay, we're glad you're here tonight, and I'll hand things over to you now.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. Good evening, everyone. I have the absolute pleasure of being your moderator, and we have a wonderful evening planned with three distinguished panelists. And this is our second time together as a group, and not a very long amount of time. And the last time, I feel, Dr. Clarke, you were so close to breaking out into song. So perhaps tonight, maybe a bit of Peaches and Herbs reunited, that would be fitting.
It could happen.
We'll see what happens, right? We'll let it go. So we have the pleasure of hearing from each of you read from your memoirs this evening, and we will then go into a discussion and a Q&A, as Cassandra mentioned. So if you have questions throughout the evening, she mentioned to put them into the chat, and I will do my best to get to as many of those as I possibly can. So we are going to dive into your readings, but I'm going to start with introductions. And I will begin with Senator Don Oliver. The Honourable Donald H. Oliver, CMONSQC, retired as a member of the Senate of Canada in 2013 after 23 years of service. He was a lawyer, professor, farmer, businessman, author, cordon bleu chef, and senator who rose to serve with distinction as Deputy Speaker in the Senate of Canada, as chairman of 6 standing committees of Parliament, as chairman or deputy chairman of 7 interparliamentary associations, and as a ubiquitous spokesperson for diversity, pluralism, fairness, and equality, for which he was awarded 5 honorary doctorate degrees from Canadian universities. Dr. Oliver's memoir, which I have right here, and I see behind Dr. Francis as well, A Matter of Equality, the life's work of Senator Don Oliver, was published by Nimbus Publishing in 2021. So welcome, Dr. Oliver. We will now introduce the Honourable Dr. Mayann Francis, ONS, served as Lieutenant Governor for the province of Nova Scotia from 2006 to 2012. She was the first African Nova Scotian and second woman to be appointed as the Vice-Regal Representative. She is the second African Canadian to be appointed Lieutenant Governor in Canada. Dr. Francis served from 2015 to 2020 as the first Distinguished Public Service Fellow in the Faculty of Management, School of Public Administration at Dalhousie University. In December 2020, she was appointed as the Dean's Warden for the Cathedral Church of All Saints in Halifax. She is the recipient of 7 honorary degrees and an honorary diploma. She has served in many leadership roles, including chair of the board for the Atlantic School of Theology. Dr. Francis graduated from St. Mary's University with a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Master's in Public Administration from New York University. In addition to her list of credentials, Dr. Francis can add author. Nimbus Publishing published her first book, Mayann's Train Ride, in October 2015, which was translated into French in 2018. Her memoir, which of course you know I have here as well, An Honourable Life, was released in June 2019 and was listed in the Hill Times list of 100 best nonfiction books in 2019. Her memoir was also shortlisted for the Evelyn Richardson Nonfiction Award in June 2020, and the Audible version of her memoir is also available. Her second children's book is scheduled for publication this year. She is in great demand as a speaker and is sought after for her leadership experience. Welcome, Dr. Francis. And last but certainly not least, the 4th Poet Laureate of Toronto and the 7th Parliamentary Canadian Poet Laureate, George Elliott Clarke, was born in Windsor, Nova Scotia in 1960. Educated at the University of Waterloo, Dalhousie University, and Queen's University, Clarke is also a pioneering scholar of African Canadian literature, with 2 major tomes to his credit: Odyssey's Home, Mapping African Canadian Literature, and Directions Home, Approaches to African Canadian Literature. A professor of English at the University of Toronto, Clarke has taught at Duke, McGill, the University of British Columbia, and Harvard. He holds 8 honorary doctorates, plus appointments to the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada at the rank of officer. He is also a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. His recognitions include the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Fellows Prize, the Governor General's Award for Poetry, the National Magazine Gold Award for Poetry, the Premio Poésie, the Dartmouth Book Award for Fiction, the Eric Hoffer Book Award for Poetry, and the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Achievement Award. He has titles available in Chinese, Romanian, and Italian. Dr. Clarke's memoir, one second, Where Beauty Survives, an Africanian memoir, was released in 2021. So welcome, Dr. Clarke. Y'all made me work with those bios. Okay, so it's time to hear from you. It's your turn now. And it's always a treat to hear an author read their own work. So tonight we're going to begin with Dr. Mayann Francis, and she will be reading from her memoir, An Honourable Life. So Dr. Francis, you now have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay. It's always a pleasure to be working with you, and it's just a deep honor also to be here with Dr. George Elliott Clarke and Senator Oliver. I 2 people that I admire all of you, but Senator Oliver and George Elliott Clarke, you've had an influence on my life in many ways. Even though I'm older than you, Dr. Clarke, you still have an influence in many ways. So I'm just an honor to be here this evening. I like to also first acknowledge the presence of in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I also want to acknowledge my ancestors and all those warriors who fought for justice and equality. I stand on their shoulders. So what I've selected to read tonight, we'll talk about, we'll give you names of some of the people's shoulders that I stand on. And I'm going to start with chapter 3, not the whole chapter, of course, just chapter 3, a couple of pages. And then I'm going to go to the final chapter, which is chapter 12, and that will be it. And hopefully that there will be questions that you will have after that. So chapter 3, the title of the chapter is Leaving the Pier. And I think I chatted about that the last one of our other presentations. So here it is. After graduating from St. Mary's University in 1972, 3.5 years after I started, I was fortunate to secure a position with the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission and was very honored to receive the Silver Plaque Award in 1974 for outstanding contribution in the field of human rights. When I joined the commission, the executive director was George McCurdy, a truly great leader in Nova Scotia for the fight against racism and discrimination. Mr. McCurdy advocated for equal rights. He was not afraid to challenge the system and met frequently with business and government leaders. I had first come to Mr. McCurdy's attention when, as a student, I worked on textbook analysis, a summary project for the commission. He was impressed with my work and offered me employment when I completed my degree. At the commission, we set up many test cases to uncover discrimination in accommodation. It was never difficult to uncover the violations of human rights code. We would have someone Black call about an apartment, advertise for rent, and set up an appointment within an hour of speaking with the renter. When the Black person went to see the apartment, they were told it had just been rented. We would then have a white person place a call the same day, set an appointment, and visit the apartment. They would be shown and offered the apartment. There was no mention of the apartment no longer being available. Halifax was a very disturbing place in the 1960s and 70s. Racism and discrimination were alive and well. It was in the 1960s that Black people were removed from their community of Atholville and their homes and church confiscated and demolished to make way for other developments. There was either overt in-your-face racism or covert racism embedded into systems, policies, and practices that on the surface seemed neutral, but which in reality negatively impacted Nova Scotians, African Nova Scotians, First Nations, and other racial minorities. Racism and inequality were so prevalent that Halifax was visited by Stokely Carmichael, leader of the Black Panthers Party in the United States, the late Rocky Jones. In his book, Revolutionary, details the visit of Stokely and the Panthers and the state of race relations in Nova Scotia. Rocky fought for equality. He was not afraid to stand up for what was right. He took to the streets, he yelled freedom, knew when to stand and fight for the right to come in from the margins and into the center to fight for justice. He was a warrior. In 2011, I awarded Bertley Rocky Jones the Order of Nova Scotia, the highest honor to be bestowed on a Nova Scotian. Before my tenure as Lieutenant Governor ended in 2012, I invited Rocky and his wife Sharon for afternoon tea in Government House. I will always remember the look on his face, one of contentment and happiness. This was a man who fought all his life for equity and justice. Seeing me, the first Black vice-regal representative in Nova Scotia, hosting him in this stately home, put a smile on his face that cannot be described. He was proud because he knew that his fight was not in vain. After all, we were sitting in a house that our ancestors, who were slaves, helped to build. I watched Rocky slowly looking around the room, no longer smiling, looked at me, and in true Rocky style asked whether racism had raised its ugly head during my tenure. I was not surprised by his question. I did not give him a direct answer. We continued to talk. Interestingly, I found an entry in my journal after a difficult meeting with a politician and a bureaucrat while I was serving as Lieutenant Governor. I wrote, and I quote, "I only ask God to give me the wisdom and health to write my story when this is all over," end of quote. My story will answer Rocky's question. Unfortunately, he left this world too soon. He passed away in 2013. And I quote Maya Angelou in her poem, When Great Trees Fall. They existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. Now I go to the final chapter of my book, and this is what I say. As a leader, I am grounded in the ethical and spiritual beliefs. I am not afraid to be visible. Dr. Martin Luther King, in a speech he delivered on March 25th, 1968, said, and I quote, "Somebody is saying stand, so I guess I'll have to stand," end of quote. Without my foundation and my spiritual beliefs, I am not certain if I would have been able to manage the many storms and barriers I face along my journey. My faith in God is my shield and my armor. The road was not always easy, but I am proud to stand. This memoir has helped me to bring to the surface feelings I have hidden for a long time. While memories of some events are painful, I had to face them if I wanted to heal. For me, life is about forgiveness, love, respect, courage, kindness, empathy, honesty, compassion, giving back, and helping others. It is my hope that my story will inspire you to realize that you can bypass barriers and reach your goal. Hard work, continuous learning, and belief in oneself will eventually yield positive results. You must never give up. You must not allow anyone to take away your dignity or break your spirit. For those people who are angry or who perpetuated hatred, which can manifest itself in many ways, I hope you will go deep within your heart and minds and evaluate who you really are and ask the question, why am I this way? What do I need to know to be a better human being? Only the truth can set you free. As a Black disabled woman, I regularly review my personal strategies to get to where I believe God wants me to go. I worked tirelessly and fought hard to prevent anyone from breaking my spirit or blocking my road to success. To have my journey culminate to the heights of Lieutenant Governor has taught me a great deal, not only about myself, but also about life and people. Regardless of the barriers placed in front of us, there is always a way to survive. It may not seem that way when we are going through difficult times. May not seem that way, as I said. There will always be times when we will throw our hands into the air and ask, why am I putting up with this? Believe me, I have been there. I relied on my God, my family, my friends, my mentors, my advisors, and my cat Angel to help me weather many of the storms I faced at different times in my life. These were my anchors. I hope you will find yours. Rocky, I think this memoir answered your questions. Thank you for being one of the warriors upon whose shoulders I stand. Rest in peace. End of my quotes.
Wow, thank you. Yes, a virtual clap. It must be very difficult choosing just one or two passages for events like this. So, so thank you. That was wonderful. So now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Oliver, and he will be reading from his memoir, A Matter of Equality.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to make a few introductory remarks first, if I may. I want to give a special thanks to the Halifax Library for hosting us tonight. This is very special. This is the third library event I've done in the last couple of months, and I'm going to be involved in the launch of a new book club at the end of the month. So it's books, 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 writers, and reading. And the three of us here tonight are people who like to read and who have written quite broadly. And so that's special. I'm delighted and deeply honored to share this special occasion with two very distinguished Nova Scotians who have, in spite of considerable odds, risen to the pinnacle of their chosen careers, and what a contribution they have made. Mayann and George, I do salute you both. I was born in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, quaint university town where my mother and father, we had 5 kids, and we were the only Black family in town. We attended white schools and churches, shopped in all the white stores, and all of our friends were white. We got along amazingly well through hard work and a lot of prayers. In 1956, on a sunny Sunday afternoon in Wolfville, where I had been visiting my mother and father at their home, I stood with my little suitcase in hand on the shoulder of the main route out of town with my thumb up, hitching a ride back to Halifax, where I worked as a cub reporter for the Halifax Chronicle Herald. Cars passed. Some through hand and arm signals indicated that they were full and they couldn't take me with regret, and they would, and I would wave thank you as they passed by. Suddenly, as though from nowhere, a red car going at a good clip swerved over dangerously close to where I was standing. The passenger rolled down the window, spat at me, and yelled, "Get off the road, nigger." That, along with other similar incidents of in-your-face racism, remains indelibly etched in my memory. It was a life-changing event that taught me that my color, Black, would always be with me, and that in order to succeed, color was a reality that I would have to transcend. I also confirmed that there was anti-Black systemic racism throughout our province, and I would have to tackle that face on. I want to read from my book a passage that indicates some racism in that year, 1956, when I was in first year law school. But first, let me give you a little bit more context for where I'm coming from. Nova Scotians of African descent, Black people, have a 400-year history of slavery and racism. I was born a year before the start of the Second World War. And in the 40s and the 50s, we still had segregated churches, we had segregated schools, and some cemeteries and restaurants would not admit Black people. I know from personal experience, we were a subjugated people. We were held down by the doctrine of white privilege, that advantage, that perk that gave white people the edge and 1 foot up on everything we did. Historically, the reasons for that are understandable, but certainly not right. Whites today are only about 15% of the world population, but they remain the overwhelming dominant global race. They are still overwhelmingly responsible for setting the global agenda, for determining what is discussed and what is not discussed, because whites have reigned globally supreme for half a millennium. They're more than any other race have left their mark on the rest of humanity. As one writer said, they have a vested interest in denying the extent and baneful effects of racism. So here I was in the fall of 1956, attending a white law school in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with all predominantly white students and faculty, and racism was lurking, waiting, watching for me to reach out and start to preach tolerance and equality. So I want to read a very, very short section from my book from that first year in law school. There were more than a couple of times in my life when I forgot that my skin color signaled an immediate physical and emotional problem for many white people in society. One day while I was at Dalhousie Law School, I was out walking with Darrell T. Warren, a fellow Sir James Dunn scholar, a tall 6'4" white man from Saskatchewan. Darrell, or Dell as we called him, was passionate and very intense about everything he did. He and his wife had entertained me at their apartment for dinner a couple of times. She was very nice, a short woman with a winning smile. She made me feel comfortable and welcome in her home. I think they both wanted to learn more about Eastern Canada and more about Black people. I sensed that they had little direct experience with Blacks. Dell and I skipped an afternoon of studying one day in first year law to go play pool. The pool game would be another way of feeling each other out to see just what type of game each had, and to learn more about the person himself. He was eager and ready for the challenge, and so was I. I didn't tell him that when I was in my mid-teens, onlookers would pay me 25 cents if I could break the balls and shoot all 15 without missing. I collected a lot of quarters that way. We checked the yellow pages and found a pool hall near campus called the Q and Cushion. We walked into the small hall in downtown Halifax and looked over its few tables. The room was dark and smelled of cigarette smoke. No music played. Hardly anyone was there. We walked to an open table, took down our cue sticks, racked the balls, and began to play. I got off to a great start and was having a nice one when Dell vanished for a few minutes. He returned later limping. I looked at him with concern and surprise. What had happened to him? He was very agitated and anxious. He said to me in a stern voice, "Leave your cue stick on the table and come with me outdoors immediately." I did what he said and followed him as he limped out to the front door. There we ran into a tall, skinny man with a big frown on his face, so deep I could almost hear it. He had a cigarette draping from his lips. I sensed that he was the manager or the owner. He stared at me, dark and foreboding, and said, "Don't you realize you're Black? You can't come in here." He pointed his finger at Dell. "You can stay." Then he pointed back at me again. "You have to go." His racism was right in my face. How could I ever forget something so blatant and fundamental, that I was Black in a world where that meant that I would be treated worse than white people no matter what? This pool hall manager had the white power and privilege to remind me that he thought that I was not equal to white people, and that he could stay, but I must go, merely because of the color of my skin. There was no sign on the door saying I could not go in the hall to play. I had not lived long from the safety of my family home in Wolfville, and it was a sharp reminder that I would always have to be ready to defend my human rights at all times. This billiards experience instilled in me that I will be living virtually all my life with the constant reminder that I am different from most other Canadians, and that somehow I must prove that I am worthy to enjoy the same benefits as the white majority. Dell and I walked back to campus, thoughtful under the afternoon light. I asked him why he was limping. He stopped. "I just made that up," he said. "I did not want to tell you inside the things the man said about you when he pulled me aside and told me that you had to go. I felt that if I was limping, that you would not question it at all, but would follow me out, and you did." Dell did not want to have a scene inside the pool hall. I really think that Dell was more shaken by the incident than I was. He had never been party to anything like that sort of blatant racism in his life. We 5 Oliver kids had been called pickaninnies in school, and some other names, and we had seen a lot more than that. Back on campus, we started to talk about it and what had happened. Like good law students, we researched the law on issues. I called the Department of Justice and the provincial government and explained what had happened. My human rights had been violated on racial grounds. I said that such discrimination had to end. The person who took my call said legislation was being drafted that might help. They sent me a copy of the draft and requested my input. I made several notes for changes in the draft legislation. The bill, the Fair Accommodation Practices Act, would make it into the law of the province of Nova Scotia, saying essentially that no one can be kept out of a place to which the public is customarily admitted on the basis of their skin color. The bill became law and later became part of the broader Human Rights Act. Places like the Q and Cushion would no longer be legally allowed to bar the public based on race. In the meantime, the Q and Cushion still would have nothing to do with Black people in its establishment. So the owners had their lawyers incorporate them as a private society under the Societies Act. You have to become a member of the society to enter the pool hall, and they could refuse membership to anyone. I never did apply to become a member. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much. Yes, again. Thank you, Dr. Oliver. Both you and Dr. Francis, what you've shared so far are wonderful segues to our discussion. So you're making my job very easy at the moment. So good choices. And we'll now move on to Dr. George Elliott Clarke. And I will just remind everyone, if you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And I will say, Dr. Clarke, we do have a request for a song in there already. That did not take long, so no pressure. No pressure. But the numbers.
If the spirit moves, you never know what could happen. But I just want to say, Lindsay, thank you so much. Thank you also to the Halifax Public Library, to our audience. And I also need to say what a great honor and privilege it is for me to be speaking as part of our panel this evening with two great African Nova Scotians, symbols of achievement and triumph. And of course, I am referring to Her Honor Mayann Francis and the Honourable Senator Donald H. Oliver. So I'm going to read a little bit about education and basically what I experienced as a boy. So I'll start here. This is grade school, and a few years later, at the end of grade 3, when I was 8, I happened to be at home alone and picked up the ringing phone's receiver on a late June afternoon. The caller, a woman, asked to speak with my parents, but they were out, and I asked politely, as I had been taught, whether I could take a message. The lady responded that she had wanted to talk to my parents because my test scores had been startlingly high, and she had wanted to share that fact with them. I don't believe she left either name or number, though I did report the call and the message to my parents, who then began to talk about enrolling me in the Halifax Grammar School, a private school founded in 1958. They asked me for my opinion, and I shook my head no. First, I was concerned about the potential cost. Secondly, I didn't want to be separated from my chums. Thirdly, I fretted that my sacred identity as the smartest kid in the class, who also happens to be colored, would be lost were I immersed with a lot of junior geniuses. My parents decided not to pursue the possibility, and I remained among my peers. It was likely about then that our local ghetto grocery store offered hardcover science-oriented encyclopedias, a dozen, for about $2 each. Well, my parents bought them and gifted them to me. But how weird it was that a grocery store whose floors were black with dirt and whose greens were often brown was bothering to offer its welfare payee clientele science encyclopedias and Great Masters art reproductions, which my parents also bought. Another incident that pinpointed me as a public school whiz kid occurred when I was 10 in grade 5. Out of all the Haligonian pupils available, I was chosen to answer a letter from a 10-year-old American from California who had written randomly to any Halifax school to sound Canadian perceptions of the USA. Unfortunately for my pen pal, I was a nascent nationalist, thanks to being sick and tired of American books dominating library shelves. Not only that, but the Guess Who's anthemic and anti-American hit American Woman from 1970 had impressed itself on my inner ear. My answer to the Californian was also highly critical of his country, and I likely cited the Vietnam War, riots, and assassinations, not to mention Yankee domination of English Canada's art and intelligentsia, as good reasons for Canuck rebuke of our southern neighbors. It still bothers me that my interlocutor did not respond to my letter. Then again, he was likely shocked by its contents. More George Grant than George Washington. Naturally, it was my mom who took me to the Halifax North Memorial Library in the winter of 1968 when I was 8, to pick up my first library card. We lived on Maynard Street, approximately 4 blocks from the library, and she trusted me to get there and back with an armload of books, often twice a day. Then again, my parents knew I could lead my brothers and later Aunt Joan's daughters, Jerry, named for my mom, and Donna, to school and back. So after that initial library trip, I was free, in concert with my mom's investment in Maria Montessori's teachings, to make my way solo to and from that palace of vertical word-imprinted spines, the pillars of imagination and information, but also that gallery of pyrotechnic book covers, each of them a stained glass window onto fantasy, sci-fi, or factual science. North Branch librarian Miss D, Adelia A. Mooney, took note of my prodigious capacity for borrowing and reading and returning heaps of books. And once aware of my frustration of not having anything new or interesting to read on the elementary side of the library, she gave me early permission to cross over into the adult section. Yes, I'd exhausted all the kiddie holdings of Greek, Roman, and Norse myth, plus Alice and Oz and Narnia, plus World War narratives, plus all Isaac Asimov and Herbert S. Zim books on touchy-feely robots, alien worlds, and the psychopathic saber-toothed Tyrannosaurus Rex, plus spooky books, mysteries and horrors, Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, Sherlock Holmes, Edgar Allan Poe, plus Canadiana up the yin-yang, Pierre Burton, Sheila Burnford, Catherine Anthony Clarke, and the like. Normally, one had to be 15 to borrow books from the adult wing, but Miss A. Mooney permitted me that leeway when I was 10, for she knew that she could eye whatever titles that I was scouting and hold back whatever could be too amoral or immoral for my tender eyes and budding mind. I'm sure she did a responsible job of double-checking my desires, but I did take out one book, a crime thriller mystery, in which the fascinating scientific-looking word pudenda appeared. It became as much of a thrill to possess as did another scientific term, tachyon, which I also acquired that summer of 1940. Like Miss A. Mooney, that summer of 1970. Summer of 1940, summer of 1942 was a movie. So, all right, sorry for that interruption of pop culture. So, like Miss A. Mooney, Terry Simons was a vital overseer of my reading interests. I got to say it, unfortunately, the late Terry Simons. More importantly, he was black like me, a dude from our blocks, and in the mid-1970s, he was added to the library staff, at first to stymie delinquents who might want to act out their disaffection with home and school by disrupting the library's patented quiet. Terry could parley frankly with everyone, and he'd been to Africa, to Ghana, and had returned as an avid spokesman for Black uplift and pride. So he wasn't just a bouncer, if that had been his first role, but an in-house griot who saw it as his mission to give us young bloods some guidance. By 1977, he was screening films expressly for us Black youth. After the library had closed for the day in the auditorium, thanks to Terry, I saw Lady Sings the Blues, Billie Holiday's bio elevated to Hollywood-scale Technicolor treatment in 1978. It was an electrifying experience. There we were, a gathering of Black kids or young adults, finally becoming attuned to our heritage. Terry also screened for us the Bill Cosby narrated 1968 documentary, Black History Lost, Stolen, or Strayed. In addition, Terry would rap about real life, explain why it was important to be an in-the-home father, why we should complete school, why we should go to Africa. He was of us, the hood, the people, and the boys. He even played basketball. After his premature passing in 1990, a provincial sports championship got dubbed in his honor, the Terry Simons Memorial Invitational Basketball Tournament. But Terry and I had a personal bond. Whenever he thought my afro was becoming a fright, as it is right now, he'd summon me to the North End Library basement. He'd grab his clippers and give me a free haircut on the spot. So the library was not only a second home for me, but also a barbershop, a cinema, and a schoolhouse for lessons in diasporic African history and culture from Nigeria to New Orleans to Nova Scotia.
Wow. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Your afro looks great. Don't even. It looks great.
All right.
But there was no music. No music.
We were so close. We
I
were
was
so
I
close.
was hearing it, you know, in the background there. Oh, girl, the shy lights and all that. You know, back in the day, Soul Train. Whoa, sorry.
You know it's in you. You just got to bring it out. Bring it out.
We know why you're always singing. Based on what you just read, we get it. We get it. Plus, you have the talent. You're good. You're good.
So we're going to move into our discussion. Thank you, all of you, for sharing. And again, all excellent segues to this discussion. And I'll start keeping an eye on the chat as well, but I'm going to kick it off. And you talked about all those library books, which we're seeing some really, I would call, important books being taken from shelves right now due to these different censorship regulations. One example is a book called The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And the argument is that it promotes an anti-police message. So I want to ask you, Dr. Francis, because you're all very transparent in your books. You're very honest in just the blatant hate that was thrown at you, thrown at your family. Dr. Oliver, you gave concrete examples of that in the pool hall. When you were writing your memoirs, ever in the writing process, was there a moment when you felt, maybe I should hold back? You know, maybe this is too much, or maybe if I'm too transparent, this will not be well received. And I don't want to give an example of a way that you give in your book, Dr. Francis, for those who maybe didn't read it, but you had to wait for your home to be prepared. That was your home. And there were some real issues there. So I want to ask you, was there ever a back and forth in that writing process, and how much you're sharing?
Very interesting question. And I also want to say thank you to the library as well as to Nimbus for this evening, because here we go. We're talking about our book, why we wrote our book, reading some stories in our book and so forth. So your question is a very, very important question. And I have to say, during the writing, sometimes I just stopped because the emotion that I was feeling brought tears to my eyes, and I became angry. And then I said, I really should write X, Y, Z. And that would have been naming people who were clearly what I would consider who were racist. But then I said, no, I don't think I'm going to name them right now, even though I do have their names. The reason I didn't say it because I want people to read the story, understand the story, analyze the story, also to look at the story as an inspirational story as well. But not only as an inspirational story to people who are Black, people of color, people who are disabled or whatever, but it's also to look at yourself if you wondered, if you understood what systemic discrimination is all about, if you understood what people mean when they say white privilege, what do people mean when they say unconscious bias? Do you understand that? Are you going to be going and looking and seeing? And somebody recently was reading my book and reached out to me because they were angry that I, as a Black woman, was left out of Government House for 3 years. They could not understand that. Their view was, if you were white, you would have been in that house within a year, maybe a year and a half, not kept out for 3 years. So this was this person who read this book in anger said this. And when I told the truth about it, asking those questions about how come a top person didn't say, get this done now, 24/7 is how long we're going to work to make sure it's going to work out properly. I don't know if you remember the vice president in the United States, the home where she was going to be living as the vice president was also closed down, but only for a short time, for about 2 months or so. I think 2 months, it might have been a little bit longer. But in any event, they made sure that she was in that house, not kept out of it for a long period of time. So I have to give credit to that, because she did complain and say, I can't stay out here any longer than what I'm out here now. But in any event, it didn't matter to what was happening here. I was kept out. So in terms of writing my story, as I said earlier, there were times when I stood back and stopped because I was so upset. And then I just prayed. I said, God, help me to get this story done. Because I thought it was absolutely critical that I tell the story not only of what happened to me for 3 years of not being in the house, but also throughout my journey. Even though my journey has been successful, it wasn't easy. It was not easy. But there were people around that helped me get through it. There was also God. If it wasn't for my faith in God, I don't know if I would have made it. That's me. I'm not saying that everybody has to have faith in God. I wish they would, but I'm not going to condemn you if you don't. But in any case, that's how I consider myself as moving forward and being very strategic in my story. Maybe I need to write another book. It could be very different. Everybody think I should, but anyhow.
Yeah.
I second that idea.
I can't keep up with you. How many have you written already now? So, Lindsay, you've written God knows how many. So,
Oh my gosh, no, not that many. I have three that are all my own.
still, you did. Congratulations.
Not about me. It's not about me.
I just want to include you. That's it.
That and that's good to know, because I felt that anger as well, like that reader. And then when you talk about walking in, I was cheering. My children were sleeping, but I was trying to stay quiet, but I was thinking, finally, like that feeling you must have felt to walk through those doors to say you're home must have been just incredible. So I am glad you were honest and included that all in your memoir. So thank you for that. And going off of that, I also want to talk about the motivation behind writing a memoir. And I think for me, one of them would be setting the record straight. And there's a real chance to do that with a memoir. And Dr. Oliver, you talked about how a lot of history, especially Black history, is written by people who choose to tell one side. They're not telling the whole story. So how important for you, Dr. Oliver, in writing your memoir, was it important to ensure your story, your life's accounts were told properly, honestly, accurately, as transparent as you wanted it to be?
Yeah, mine was really a 10-year process, because 10 years before I started to write, people had said, look, you should have some kind of a book. Why don't you talk to some writers, see if they'll do it? And so I talked to many writers, and some gave proposals for the kind of thing that would go in. And I had all of the debates of the Senate. I had more than 100 speeches that I've given around the world to places like Microsoft for Bill Gates and others. Really good stuff that could be written about. I've lectured in many countries around the world. Those speeches were available, and the proposals I got back did not include any of that. And so I said, look, where's the worldview that Black people have to have? And if I had it, why aren't they going to write about it? So it finally took Mayann Francis to pick up the phone and say, look, you should write and tell the whole story. And that's what gave me the push to do it. And I started writing. I'd written about 20,000 words before that, but that's when I really started writing in earnest. And for George, it wouldn't be a lot, but I wrote 70,000 words before it got to the first editors, you know. And we all know what editors do. But I feel a lot better with the book that I have out now, in that it does tell Lindsay that other side of the story, and I hope with a little bit of to help explain to anyone wanting to read it, this is what Black people really went through.
Absolutely. And Dr. Clarke, I want to move from motivation to inspiration. And when writing your memoir, or perhaps other books, were there other writers or other books that inspired you, either by style or choice of narrative, perhaps other memoirs that stand out for you?
Oh, yes. Look, thank you so much, Lindsay, for that question. I want to begin by saying that the stories that I've been privileged to read by Mayann Francis and by Donald Oliver, and the fact that we're having this conversation, the three of us, along with yourself this evening, is inspirational, and I hope will be inspirational for people listening in and watching us right now. But the real point I want to make, and it does dovetail with the comments that we just heard from my fellow and sister panelists this evening, and that is this, that all of us in our memoirs, we are all bearing witness to our own personal life experience of the last half a millennia of the domination of the globe, economically, militarily, and culturally, by one set of human beings, European Caucasians, who through their technological advantage during the movement from the Renaissance towards what eventually became the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment philosophically and politically, managed to basically ransack the world to build themselves up. And then once they became rich and powerful, decided that that made them gods and that everybody else was inferior. Everybody else was less than human, especially Black and Indigenous people.
Exactly.
And for the last 500 years, what we've been saying through the slave narratives, through autobiographies after slavery ended, is that what a colossal lie that is, and what a destructive untruth that is. The idea that any group of human beings are superior to everybody else on the planet, and the belief that a minority of people in the world have pursued even pressing their military advantage in order to carry out that pursuit, has destroyed the environment and is bringing us to a point of catastrophe for the entire planet. So I think that anything that any of us can say, even with our own puny human lifespans, through this period of the last 500 years, to say this is wrong, and it's inhuman, and it's inhumane, and it has to stop before the entire human species is obliterated in the name of some folks' greed, we have to say it. And so to continue to answer your question, the memoir that I go back to again and again and again is the autobiography of Malcolm X. I go back to it because I teach it in my graduate classes from time to time, but I also have to go back in my own autobiography, when I was 17 and 18 and reading that book for the first time. And I want to say to everybody, yes, Malcolm X, as Malcolm Little and as Malcolm X, was a sexist. He said anti-Semitic things, and he could also say racist things. So, and he was homophobic. So, not a poster boy for the most humane considerations of anything. But the one good thing that Malcolm X puts forward, actually a couple of really terrific things that he puts forward in his autobiography, is number one, the need to analyze, the need to be able to explain what is going on in your world, to think it through without falling prey to ideology and dogma of any sort. And we see in reading through his life how he managed to change, how he managed to make himself better, how he moved beyond his initial prejudices and became much more humane and humanitarian, while never giving up the ability to speak truth to power and to be authentic in terms of his own culture. And so I find that message empowering and transformative. And the other important thing about Malcolm X, for me, the fact he wore glasses, the fact that he read books, the fact that he was not a nerd, and he loved reading, and he loved writing, and he loved argument, and he loved debate. The fact that he was an intellectual in a hurry. I loved that. I say, yes, give me that suitcase, give me that alarm clock, give me that wristwatch, give me that plane ticket. I want to go places and make speeches and tell people the truth. And that's that. So, yeah.
I love it. I love it. Give me that plane ticket too. I need a plane ticket. We all need some plane tickets right now.
Right on.
We do have a comment here, and this is to all of you. It just says, thank you so much for sharing your truths in such an inspirational way. And I will absolutely second that. And I want to talk now about target audience, because when you're writing a memoir, I'm curious, because I have not written one, is there a target audience? And obviously, Dr. Francis, your children's books, we have the target audience, but when you're writing your memoir, you talked a bit in your book about what your hope for the reader was who picks up your book, but is there a visual or a thought of who that reader is, or are you just writing and telling your story and whoever picks it up? And I'll ask you first, Dr. Francis.
Writing my story, my intention was the book for everybody, actually. And it was my hope that for generations, that young people would read it by the time they became in their teens or older, maybe in their 20s or 21, they'd find the book someplace and just read it so that they can understand what a successful Black person went through, even though they were successful. And so the book was also in my head was, as I said earlier, it was also to encourage people to stay strong and to love themselves and do not be ashamed because their skin is Black or, you know, whatever. I don't want people to feel that as a Black person, we're inferior. And so I just wanted that story to be told. And I also wanted to tell the story in terms of religion as well, because that's me. If it wasn't for my faith in God and my belief in God and my understanding that God is my leader. He's the person putting me out to do certain things. I wanted my story to be part of that as well. And I know when you asked earlier, George, about other books that have influenced him and so forth. I mean, reading like about Desmond Tutu, who I admired very much. That's another one. So, you know, religious writers who were Black and who wrote about challenges that they've experienced, but it was through God that set them forward. So, so my hope for the book is that, you know, it's not about finances or anything. I just want people to read the book and understand the effect of racism. It can have it does have a psychological effect. I don't care what anybody says, it does. And it all depends on how strong you are and people around you who are helping you to get through it, because it's a difficult journey. Even if you experience it as a child, it stays with you. You don't forget it. And Senator Oliver, you mentioned about that not forgetting what's happened to you in your young life, and you just don't forget it. And sometimes when it happens again as you're older, but in maybe a little bit more sophisticated way, it's still detrimental. And being the first in every position that I've held was challenging. Happy to give the experience of being the first and hoping that there will be a number 2, a number 3, a number 4 in it. But being the first in a role, very, very challenging. But again, it's my faith in God that gave me the strength and the courage to continue.
Mm. And Dr. Oliver, you shared with me as well that you really want younger people, future generations, to read your book and to hear these stories. So were they also in your mind as an audience as you were writing your book as well?
Oh, very much so. They have to know who their forefathers were. And as Mayann said, the people on whose backs we were carried. And that's very important. But another important thing in the book that is, for me, is very, very important is the discussions that I had about a business case for diversity. Now, it sounds like a lot of fancy words, but the essence of it is, in order to have a tolerant Canada and a society that treats people fairly and equally, we have to have diversity. And diversity means accepting difference. And so if someone has a haircut like George, you just have to look at it and accept it. and if he came in here with a safari outfit or something, we'd have to accept it. So that the main thing in my book, at least, is diversity is the key to the future. The business case for diversity is the key to the future, and diversity means accepting anything that's different from you and just say it's different, but they've got a lot to contribute, and our diversity is going to make us all stronger. And that's how we can get a more tolerant Canada. And George, you mentioned Malcolm X, another book that I hope that you're teaching at the same time, because he was a brilliant writer, Stokely Carmichael. I mean, he was a professor, he was very, very well read, and did some provocative writing about a lot of American things, went to Africa ultimately, but was a great thinker who went through almost the same sort of thing that Malcolm X did.
Yeah, Don, that's a great little segue, and I'll just add very quickly to your comments and those of Mayann by saying that I think the value of all of these memoirs, Stokely's, as you've mentioned, Rocky's, which Mayann mentioned earlier this evening, yours, Mayann's, Barack Obama's Dreams from My Father, which I have taught as well. And even the memoir of Canada's greatest bank robber, who happens to be, of course, I shouldn't say of course, but happens to be related to me, but Ricky Atkinson, who's a Scotian. He's a Scotian, but he's the guy who invented the use of the spike belt to stop fleeing vehicles. That's him. That's a Scotian who wanted to stop the Toronto police from chasing him, so he came up with the spike belt. And he robbed 70 banks and spent half his life behind bars. He's on probation until 2035. I teach his memoir too. But I think all of these memoirs have in common, and he's very open about the fact that growing up in Toronto, he had a lot of racism in the 1950s. It doesn't explain that he chose the wrong path to deal with it, absolutely. But to get to the point, what I'm trying to say here is that our life experiences through the African diaspora, men and women, in sports, in government, in the arts, always bear the same message, more or less, which is that you have to bear up. You've got to have the spiritual strength that Mayann talks about. You have to have the acumen and smarts that you, Don, and Mayann both really represent. Also, dignity to rise above and transcend and get through things, and not to let anybody stop you by throwing up all their foolish obstacles of lies and hindrances of one sort or another, and to also carry a sense of beauty and grace into all kinds of untoward situations and activities, in terms of trying to make our way forward, in terms of trying to forge a way forward, and maybe do things that nobody's ever really done before, or thought about things nobody's really thought of before. I think of the fact that the probable fact that the slap shot came from the Africville hockey team. You look at that book, Black Ice, they talk about that. That's where the slap shot came from, and in hockey. And I think, of course it did, because the whole three-point swish shot in basketball also comes from us folks. The slap shot applies to hockey, the swish shot in basketball. That's what it does. So I think that ultimately what these memoirs do, these autobiographies do, is encourage and inspire and instill strength and confidence, because we can know that if our forebears or our elders could do it, then so can we. And nor should we ever think that things are easier. They may not be easier. They may just look better in terms of camouflage. They may look better, but things may be just as bad now as they were 40, 50, 60 years ago. I hope not, but I wouldn't want to tell anybody. I wouldn't want to tell my daughter that she doesn't have to worry. I wouldn't want to tell her that. In fact, I don't tell her that. I tell her she has to be concerned. She has to be aware. She has to know. She can't afford to be ignorant. And as the last thing I'm going to say maybe tonight is that we can never afford to be ignorant. The stupidest thing in the world for us is to say that it's okay to be stupid. It's not. It's not. We defeat ourselves and we accept ignorance. We cannot. We have to be a people against ignorance, and absolutely for education and intelligence, to be intellectuals and shake the world to its foundations.
Well, you have bumped up our intelligence because we now know who invented the spike belt. We're already smarter tonight, right?
It's in the Toronto Police Museum.
Who knew?
I'm so glad you said what you have said, because it makes perfect sense in terms of the reality. What may have happened in the 60s, it's still here in many respects. Racism and systemic discrimination, alive and well. Unfortunately, it is still here. And I have a question for you, Dr. Clarke. Are you teaching the memoirs of your two people here tonight?
Oh.
Well, you know what?
Oh.
You know what?
I would say.
Oh.
I have an absolute stunning answer to that question, which is I have, by the grace of God, I have a graduate student who is investigating she's a PhD candidate, and I'm her supervisor. So eventually, I think in the next couple of years, there will be, I suspect, a dissertation that will be taking into account your autobiographies, your memoirs.
Wow.
And so she and I will be having discussions over the next couple of years. That I will be her supervisor, and maybe longer than that. I don't know, but yeah. So this is central, and there are so many. I mean, right now that looking at African Canadian literature that are so rich. You know, we just in my class we just did Nega Meslikia's Notes from the Hyena's Belly, about his growing up through the Ethiopian and Somalian civil wars and famines and so on in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and how riveting that work is, as well as yours. And so yes, I will be sharing those works with my classes very much. In fact, I got to mention, we just did Jennifer Hostin's about being the first Black Miss Universe. And that was a lot of fun too. And again, you know, Mayann, thank you for putting me on the spot. Don't worry, I'm going to be teaching them. Don't worry. And I've got a grad student looking at them. There's a dissertation coming.
This is being recorded. Keep that in mind.
That's right. You got me on record. So yeah, we know that there is so much wisdom and political insight. And cultural insight in all that you've written, you and Dawn, and so I know that when my graduate student, who's actually from Nigeria originally, gets down to writing her papers and the dissertation, it's going to be phenomenal. And don't be surprised if she gives you a call. I got your emails anyway, so.
Senator Oliver, I'm glad I asked the question for both of us. So now we know. Now we know.
Senator Oliver was thinking it. He just wasn't asking it. Dr. Francis asked it. Now I wanna go to a common theme that ties the three of you together, and everybody knows this by now, but I'm gonna say it again for the people in the back of their living rooms or what have you. So tonight we have the first African Nova Scotian and second woman to be appointed as the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. We have the first African Canadian to be appointed Canadian Parliamentary Poet Laureate. And we also have the first African Nova Scotian male appointed to the Senate of Canada. So I want to shift a bit to current affairs because we know that a memoir is coming as well for this individual. And I want to talk about the process for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And I'll start with you, Dr. Oliver. How relatable, painful, because you've all shared your own experiences in your books, was it watching that someone in a high position such as all of you, and yet the onus of proof, despite her background, her accomplishments, the onus of proof is still always on each of you because of the color of your skin. It does not matter what your resume says. So how relatable and painful was it to watch this and to know the world was watching it as well?
I'm afraid of democracy in the United States because always there was an inherent part of democracy that meant that decency and respect for humanity were a part of our democratic system. It seems to be corroding and falling down now. And the questions that were put to that judge in those confirmation hearings were so outrageous, so inhumane, so unkind, so unfair, and so racist that I had to shake my head at the system. I was delighted and overwhelmed, and I had tears when I watched her deportment and the way that she was able to accept those nasty, vicious questions and deal with them on a very professional, high level. And she always kept her composure. And so it's just an example of what we Black people have to go through. And it's just not very easy at all. I was once on a short list to become a judge, and certain things happened in the background. And you know, it's her, but she was someone I deeply admire. And I'll tell you, she's going to make a difference in that Supreme Court. And she's going to be able to work with people who have still some goodness in them, like John Roberts, the Chief Justice. And the two of them are going to be able to turn that court around and to make it back to what it should be. I mean, I'm hoping it's not going to happen in a year or two, but she is that strong and that good a judge.
And to go along with that, there's a very popular phrase, when they go low, you go high. And Dr. Francis, you put in your book, which I love, when they go in the gutter, you step onto the curb. Mm-hmm. So this is expected, especially as individuals such as yourselves, as public figures. But how hard is it sometimes to keep that composure in your writing as well? You know, Dr. Francis, you said I could have named names, but I did not name names. How do you keep that composure publicly and also in your writing? Because you have a platform there, but it's what you choose to do with it. So Dr. Francis, I'll ask that to you.
You know, when you asked the question about the Chief Justice Jackson, what I couldn't watch it all because it was too much. The questions they were asking her, it was just, anyway, I was just losing it. But she was a very dignified, she is a very dignified, but extremely intelligent, very strategic in how she answered the questions. And, you know, when the questions were asked her, they were so stupid that she just had this look on her face, but she answered with such class and dignity. And that's what's important. She didn't lose her temper and go off or anything like that. She didn't do that. And that's somebody that you admire. And that's what I would say, bravo to you for answering the questions the way you did. So would I have answered questions like that, if I was asked, and have I gone through that experience? The answer is yes. And I think I remember in the book where this person clearly was racist, said to me how they just love Aretha Franklin out of the blue. I said, well, I love country western music. Absolute silence. Absolute silence. And they turned very red. So that was my dignified answer. But everybody knows I love Aretha Franklin. Don't ever, I mean, God but, so it's things like that. You got to be strategic in your answer and think, because the stupidity and of things being said. And one of the questions that they asked the judge was, what do you think of a baby, a young kid being given a book that says they're racist? Come on.
Yep.
And her answer to that was so dignified. She answered it and she analyzed it. She talked about sexism. She talked about kind of homophobia. It was just great how she answered it, but it was so stupid. I just said, oh my gosh. But she did it with dignity, and that's the way you go. Did I answer your question? Because I just went crazy, basically.
No, you you did not go crazy. We know you love Aretha, and we know you love country western.
I do. I grew up in Cape Breton. Remember Whitney? I know the music.
I am with you on that one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Takes all kinds.
But that was shocking to the person, right? Ooh, blind.
Well, just remind them that the banjo itself, which is a central instrument in country and western, comes from West Africa. Bangwiri, that's the roots of the banjo.
Absolutely.
And for all I know, the very idea of the yodel in country and western probably might have something to do with the southern drawl as also being a central component. And the southern drawl, the southern accent, is the white appropriation of black speech, black enslaved people's speech. And so country and western is not indivisible from black culture. It's part of our culture as well. And but it's been, borrowed by Nashville and borrowed by Dixie and so on. And it's okay. It's okay, but recognize your roots. Recognize your roots. Recognize where you got that stuff from. And pay proper respect, for crying out loud. But I'll just try to answer the question very quickly as well, which is to say this. I think we're in I want to be positive, and I am, and I have faith as well. And I do believe that to quote Lincoln, the better angels of our natures will prevail in the end. But in the meantime, we are facing a very dangerous time in the world right now. And this has to do with the perception that some have that the only possible order for humanity is for a particular minority to continue to be the lords and masters of the universe. As members of that particular minority, European and Caucasians, especially in the United States, as well as in Western Europe in particular, begin to feel that the rise of China is a threat to them, begin to feel that the upsurge of achievement by people of color as minority citizens in our Western democracies is somehow a threat to them, that they will turn to violence as a way of trying to suppress the drive towards equality on the part of those who are possessed with melanin, and will rely on all kinds of very shoddy arguments and deceit and fraud and again violence. Perhaps, unfortunately, in an effort to maintain their preferred notions of a proper world order. And I see that lurking behind the insolence towards the judge. I also see it lurking behind those who organized the truck convoy that occupied Ottawa and certain strategic border crossings in the country, and the support that those people had from either retired or active law enforcement as well as military personnel. seeing and the caches of weapons that were found and so on in Alberta, I don't think any of this is accidental. I think the attack on the Capitol in the U.S. Was a shot across everybody's bow about from folks who are not willing to accept the idea of equality and of multiculturalism, anti-racism. They are not prepared to accept it. And I believe that many of those who took part in the trucker convoys in Canada last winter had the very same ideology, very same thought patterns. And unfortunately, in our history, these kinds of groups have from time to time actually exercised power, not just with Donald Trump in the United States, but with particular provincial governments in Canada, Saskatchewan in the 1920s, Quebec with the Adrien Arcand fascistic movement in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s even, with social credit government in British Columbia, seizing Doukhobor children, for instance, not to mention the seizing of children of Indigenous people and so on, and Black people in Nova Scotia and in Ontario, for crying out loud. So when these kinds of groups end up exercising power, usually by suppressing the vote, which is the one way they can actually manage to get themselves into power. They almost never can get elected just through straight outright getting voted in. They have to manipulate the electoral process. They've got to steal and stuff ballot boxes. They've got to suppress the vote of minorities who they do not respect and who they fear, and especially fear having to compete equally. I'm talking too much. I'll just say one last thing. What we describe as white supremacy, what we think of as white supremacy is the fear that those people have of having to compete equally without having special advantages or privileges. That's what it is. It's the attempt to maintain an upper hand when it comes to supposedly fair and equal competition. That's what it is. And we'll never get rid of it until everybody is agreed that the only way to have a truly just society is to have true equality of opportunity and fair and equal competition.
And that's a great segue, because we do have to close, which I hate to say it, but that is why literature and your books are so important. For me, when you write these things down, you're immortalizing history, you're celebrating the wins, but you're also unearthing the hatred, the awfulness, so that people are aware of what is happening around the world. So I think that's why these discussions are so important. And I'm so thankful to each of you for telling your truths, to being so honest and transparent and just straight up entertaining, really. I really just enjoy your company. So it was an absolute pleasure to spend some time with you all this evening. Thank you to each of you for taking the time. Writing is a labor of love. So I'm so glad that each of you sat down and took the time to write these memoirs and share them with others, because they're each so beautiful and so important. And I want to thank all of you for there and there. Was I supposed to do that again? I'm sorry.
Go.
I can't. Oh, look at this. Wow. We are such a good team. That was excellent. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining you. I hope everyone has enjoyed watching and listening. And you can find all three of these books, this is going to be completely natural, that were featured tonight at your local bookstores, Indigo and Amazon. I highly recommend you read them all to be inspired, to be educated. Absolutely pick each of these up. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you again. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Mayann.
Thank you,
Library.
Wonderful. The library, Nimbus, TD Bank,
Nimbus.
And my friends. Thank you so much. Everybody who was watching. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.